The morning they found Sheriff Tom Bradshaw standing outside Helen Reeves' farmhouse in sub-zero wind, banging on metal shutters with both fists until his knuckles bled, most people in Cordell County finally understood what preparation actually meant. Because 3 days earlier, that same man had been the loudest voice at the grain elevator, joking that Helen was turning her house into a prison over weather reports nobody else took seriously. Now his own apartment building sat frozen and abandoned 2 miles away while he begged for shelter at the one door in the county that could still open. But that moment came later. The story really began in October, when Helen Reeves did something that turned her into the talk of every diner, co-op, and Sunday service in Cordell County. She started welding. Not small repairs. Not decorative projects. She began fabricating heavy steel shutters in her machine shed and bolting them directly over every window of her 2-story farmhouse. Thick metal panels with reinforced hinges that folded outward when open but locked flat against the exterior walls when closed. The kind of shutters you might see on a hurricane-prone coastline, not on the Nebraska plains where wind was common but tornadoes were the only real threat, and those came in spring, not winter. Helen worked alone most days, the sharp crack of her welder echoing across the empty fields while orange sparks fell like rain onto the gravel driveway. She was 56, lean and weathered from decades of farm work, her silver hair always pulled back in a tight braid. Her husband had died 4 years earlier, leaving her the land, the equipment, and a tendency towards self-reliance that most neighbors mistook for stubbornness. At first, people just watched with mild curiosity. Helen had always been quiet, competent, the kind of woman who fixed her own machinery and never asked for help she didn't need. But when the shutters started going up, curiosity turned to commentary. "Looks like she's boarding up for the end times," someone said at the feed store, drawing a few chuckles. "Maybe she knows something we don't," another replied, though not seriously. By mid-November, Helen had installed shutters on every window, including the small ones near the roofline that required scaffolding to reach. She reinforced her front and back doors with steel plating. She built a covered entry system over the porch, extending the roofline outward and enclosing it with removable panels that created an airlock-style entrance. The farmhouse began to look less like a home and more like a structure designed to withstand siege conditions. That was when the jokes started spreading in earnest. Sheriff Bradshaw mentioned it during a weekend breakfast shift at Lonnie's Diner, the central gathering spot for anyone with an opinion in Cordell County. He sat at the counter, coffee steaming in front of him, shaking his head while addressing the room at large. "Drove past the Reeves place yesterday," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like she's building a bunker out of her own house. All those metal shutters. I don't even know what she thinks is coming." A farmer 2 stools down grinned. Maybe she heard something on one of those survivalist podcasts. You know how people get when they spend too much time alone. Laughter rippled through the diner. Even Lottie, wiping down the counter, smirked. Helen's always been a little different. Remember when she insisted on keeping that old hand pump by her well? Like running water was going to stop working. "Exactly," Bradshaw said, draining his coffee. "Some people prepare for problems that don't exist just so they can feel smarter than everyone else." Helen never responded to the gossip because she rarely came into town anymore. She had finished her preparations and shifted focus entirely to stocking supplies. Firewood stacked 8 feet high along the north side of the house, all of it covered in dry. Propane tanks filled and secured. A backup generator tested weekly. Pantry shelves lined with canned goods. Dried beans, flour, rice, and preserved vegetables from her summer garden. She also installed something nobody else noticed, a secondary heat source. A small, efficient wood stove in the main living area, vented carefully through an insulated flue, capable of heating the entire downstairs even if the furnace failed. She sealed gaps around door frames, added insulation to the attic, and checked every system twice. Her younger brother, Paul, stopped by one afternoon in late November. He stood in the driveway, staring at the metal-covered windows with visible concern. "Helen, what are you doing?" he asked when she came outside. "Winterizing," she said simply. "This isn't winterizing. This is something else." He gestured toward the shutters. "You're making people talk. Let them talk." Paul exhaled slowly. "You really think something bad's coming?" Helen looked past him, toward the flat horizon where gray clouds were beginning to gather. "I think people trust systems that were never designed to handle extremes." And I think those systems fail faster than anyone expects. Paul didn't have an answer for that. He left 20 minutes later, still unconvinced, still thinking his sister had gone too far. 3 weeks later, the National Weather Service issued a winter storm warning for central Nebraska. A strong system moving in from the Dakotas, heavy snow expected, temperatures dropping into the teens. Standard winter weather. Nothing anyone hadn't seen before. Helen closed her shutters that night and locked them tight. By morning, the first flakes had started to fall. And by the time people realized this storm was different, Helen Reeves was already sealed inside the only structure in Cordell County that had been built to endure what was coming. The snow began gently, the way most deceptions do. Light flakes drifting down through gray morning light, accumulating slowly on roads and rooftops, while people in Cordell County went about their routines with only minor adjustments. Schools delayed opening by 2 hours. The county plow made its first pass through town. Farmers checked livestock and added extra bedding to barns. Standard procedure for early December. But by noon, something had shifted. The snow thickened into a steady curtain that erased visibility beyond a few hundred yards. The wind arrived next, not in gusts, but as a sustained force that pushed the snow horizontal, piling it against buildings and vehicles faster than anyone anticipated. The temperature dropped sharply, falling from the low 20s into single digits within 2 hours. Still, most people stayed calm. Cordell County had weathered winter storms for generations. Houses had furnaces, backup generators, stockpiled firewood. The power company had crews on standby. Emergency services remained operational. Everything seemed manageable until the wind intensified after dark, howling across the plains with a sound like freight trains passing overhead, and the power failed. Not gradually, not in isolated sections. The entire county grid collapsed within 20 minutes as ice-laden lines snapped under sustained pressure and transformers overloaded tried to compensate. Backup generators kicked on across town, their engines rumbling to life in the darkness. For a while, that seemed sufficient. Then the temperature dropped again. 15 below, 20 below. Cold so extreme it moved through walls like they weren't there, stealing heat faster than furnaces could replace it. Diesel fuel began gelling in storage tanks. Generators sputtered and died. Propane lines froze. One by one, the system's people depended on stopped functioning. Inside the sheriff's department, Bradshaw stood near the dispatch desk, watching his breath form clouds in the air. The building's backup generator had failed an hour earlier. The temperature inside had already dropped below 40 degrees. "We need to move people," his deputy said, teeth chattering. "The warming center at the high school is running on the same grid we are," Bradshaw interrupted. "And their generator went down before ours did." "Then where do we send them?" Bradshaw had no answer. The cold had arrived faster and harder than any forecast predicted, and now the entire county's infrastructure was collapsing under conditions it had never been designed to handle. 3 miles away, inside her farmhouse, Helen Reeves sat in her living room wearing a wool sweater, drinking hot tea beside the wood stove. The temperature inside held steady at 68 degrees. The shutters locked over every window trapped heat so effectively that the stove only needed to burn at quarter capacity. Outside, wind screamed against the metal panels, but inside, the air remained still and warm. She had closed the shutters fully the morning the snow started, sealing the house completely. The entry airlock prevented drafts. The insulation she had added months earlier kept warmth from escaping through the roof. Every preparation she had made worked exactly as intended, creating a controlled environment that functioned independently of everything failing outside. She listened to emergency broadcasts on a battery-powered radio, tracking the deteriorating situation across the county. Roads impassable, power out indefinitely, temperatures dropping to levels that made exposure fatal within minutes. The storm had become a crisis faster than anyone anticipated, and the people who had mocked her preparations were now facing the consequences of their assumptions. By the second night, desperation had spread through Cordell County like a physical thing. Families huddled in their coldest rooms, burning furniture in fireplaces that couldn't produce enough heat. Pipes burst inside walls. Carbon monoxide poisoning sent 3 people to the hospital before the ambulance itself became stuck in snow too deep to navigate. Sheriff Bradshaw made the decision shortly after midnight. He couldn't stay in the frozen department building any longer. His own house had lost heat 12 hours earlier. He knew of only one structure in the county that might still be warm, though reaching it meant crossing 2 miles of open country in sub-zero wind. He bundled himself in every layer he owned and pushed out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath instantly. Snow had drifted so deep in places that he sank to his thighs with every step. The wind cut through his clothing as if searching for skin. He stumbled forward, using fence lines to navigate when he could find them, moving toward the location where he remembered Helen Reeves' farmhouse standing. When the dark shape of the building finally emerged through the blowing snow, he felt a surge of relief so intense it almost brought him to his knees. But as he drew closer, confusion replaced relief. Because the house looked completely sealed. No light showed through any window. The walls appeared solid, unbroken. He couldn't even see where the door was supposed to be. Then he noticed the metal shutters, frosted over but intact, locked flat against every opening. And he understood. Helen hadn't just prepared her house. She had turned it into a sealed shelter that nothing could penetrate. Not wind, not cold, not even people who might want inside. He found the front entry, enclosed now in the airlock structure she had built. He pounded on the inner door with both fists, the sound dull and swallowed by wind. Once, twice, again and again until his knuckles split and bled against the frozen steel. Inside, Helen heard the pounding. She set down her book and walked calmly to the door, listening for a moment before speaking through the reinforced panel. "Who's there?" "It's Tom Bradshaw," came the desperate reply, barely audible through the storm. "Please, I need help." Helen stood silent for a long moment, remembering the diner, the jokes, the mockery. Then she unlocked the door and pulled it open. Bradshaw stumbled inside, gasping, his face gray with cold. She sealed the entry behind him and led him into the living room where warmth enveloped him so completely he almost collapsed. He stood there, shaking uncontrollably, staring at the glowing stove, the calm interior, the woman who had been right about everything while everyone else had been catastrophically wrong. "How?" he managed to whisper. Helen handed him a blanket. "The shutters trap heat. The stove replaces what little escapes. Everything else just holds the line." Bradshaw sank into a chair, understanding settling over him like weight. Outside, the storm continued destroying everything exposed to it. But inside Helen Reeves' sealed farmhouse, warmth and safety remained absolute. And morning was still hours away. By dawn of the third day, Helen Reeves' farmhouse had become the only structure in Cordell County that still functioned like civilization existed. While the storm continued battering the plains with wind that bent fence posts and temperatures cold enough to freeze diesel solid, Helen maintained her routine with the same quiet discipline that had built the shelter in the first place. She kept the wood stove burning steady. She rationed propane carefully. She monitored the radio for updates while Sheriff Bradshaw sat wrapped in blankets, slowly recovering from exposure. He hadn't spoken much since arriving, partly from exhaustion, partly from something heavier that Helen recognized as shame. When he finally broke the silence, his voice came out rough and unsteady. "How many people are going to die out there because we weren't prepared?" Helen refilled his coffee from the pot, staying warm on the stove. However, many didn't take the warnings seriously. There weren't any warnings. Not like this. The warnings were in the patterns, Helen said quietly. Jet stream destabilization. Polar vortex shifts. This storm wasn't unpredictable. It was just unprecedented for people who only looked backward instead of forward. Bradshaw stared into his cup. "I stood in Lonnie's diner and made jokes about your shutters. Called you paranoid in front of half the county. I know. And you still opened the door." Helen sat down across from him. Because survival isn't about being right. It's about what you do when the crisis actually arrives. Before Bradshaw could respond, pounding echoed through the entry airlock again. Helen moved to the door and called through it. A woman's voice answered, desperate and hoarse. Helen recognized it immediately, Sarah Chun, who owned the veterinary clinic in town and lived a mile south. Helen opened the door to find Sarah supporting an older man, both of them nearly frozen. "My neighbor," Sarah gasped as Helen pulled them inside. "His house lost heat yesterday. We tried to wait it out." Helen got them settled near the stove while Bradshaw helped remove their frozen outer layers. Within an hour, 2 more people arrived. Then a family of 4. Then Paul, Helen's brother, who had tried to tough it out in his own home until his generator failed and his pipes burst. He stood in Helen's living room, looking at the functioning wood stove, the sealed shutters, the calm warmth that contradicted everything happening outside. When his eyes met his sister's, he couldn't find words. "There's soup on the stove," Helen said simply, "and blankets in the closet upstairs." By nightfall, 14 people had crowded into the farmhouse. Helen organized sleeping spaces, assigned tasks, and rationed food with the same methodical precision she had used to build her preparations. Nobody complained. Nobody questioned her authority, because they all understood now that Helen Reeves had seen something coming that the rest of them had missed entirely. The storm finally broke on the 4th day. The wind died. The snow stopped. The temperature remained brutally cold, but the crisis had passed its peak. National Guard units began reaching Cordell County by late afternoon, their heavy vehicles pushing through drifts that had buried entire roads. Emergency crews found a landscape transformed by ice and destruction. Buildings collapsed under snow load. Livestock frozen in fields. Vehicles entombed in drifts so deep they wouldn't be recovered until spring. But when they reached Helen Reeves' farmhouse, they found something different. 14 people, cold but alive, emerging from a structure that looked like it had been designed for exactly this scenario. The shutters came down to reveal undamaged windows. The house itself showed no signs of stress or failure. It had simply held the line while everything around it collapsed. News crews arrived 2 days later, after the main roads had been partially cleared. They filmed the metal shutters, interviewed the survivors, and tried to understand how one woman had prepared so thoroughly while an entire county had been caught unprepared. Helen declined most interviews. She had never built her shelter for recognition. She had built it because she understood something most people didn't want to acknowledge, that comfort was temporary, and systems failed faster than anyone expected. Sheriff Bradshaw did give an interview, though. He stood in front of the county building, still without power, and spoke directly to the camera. "I mocked Helen Reeves for months," he said plainly. "Called her paranoid. Made jokes. And when the storm came, I nearly died trying to reach the only place in the county that was actually ready for it." He paused, choosing his words carefully. She didn't have to open that door, but she did. And now 14 people are alive because one person had the courage to prepare when everyone else thought she was crazy. The interview spread across regional news within hours. Within days, it had reached national outlets. Helen's farmhouse became a case study in practical preparation, featured in emergency management seminars and survivalist forums. But Helen herself remained largely unchanged by the attention. She restocked her supplies. She repaired a shutter hinge that had loosened during the storm. She returned to the routines that had kept her alive when everything else failed. 3 months later, on a clear March afternoon, Paul stopped by again. He found Helen in her garden, turning soil for spring planting. He stood watching her work for a moment before speaking. "County Council is recommending new building codes," he said. "Storm shutters, backup heating requirements, better insulation standards. They're calling it the Reeves Protocol." Helen didn't look up from her work. People always change the standards after the disaster. Never before. "Maybe that's just how it works," Paul said. "Maybe people need to see the failure before they'll do the work." Helen straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "Or maybe some people are willing to look ahead instead of just reacting to what already happened." Paul nodded slowly. "I'm building shutters on my house. Proper ones, like yours. And I'm not waiting for the next storm to finish them." For the first time in months, Helen smiled. "Good." That summer, 7 other families in Cordell County installed metal shutters. 2 rebuilt their homes with enhanced insulation and backup heating systems. The county purchased emergency generators rated for extreme cold. The changes happened quietly, without fanfare, driven not by regulation but by memory. Because everyone who lived through that storm understood something now that they hadn't before. Preparation wasn't paranoia. It was responsibility. Helen Reeves continued living alone on her farm, working her land, maintaining her systems. The shutters stayed ready. The wood stove stayed functional. And when winter returned the following year, milder this time, nothing like the storm that had nearly destroyed the county, she closed her shutters anyway, not because she expected catastrophe, but because she understood that readiness wasn't something you practiced only when disaster seemed likely. It was something you built into your life permanently, so that when the world turned hostile again, you were already prepared to endure it. And across Cordell County, in houses that now bore metal shutters of their own, others had finally learned the same lesson. Not from mockery or argument, but from the simple, undeniable proof that when everything failed, the one person they had laughed at had been the only one ready to survive.